The first thing I heard that Saturday morning was the rhythmic squeak of a folding table's legs being dragged across asphalt. It was 6:42 a.m. The sun wasn't yet fully over the eastern ridge, and the air still held the cool, damp scent of the irrigated night. My morning ritual was precise. I would wake at 6, start the coffee, and sit on my back porch overlooking the neat rows of my vineyard, watching the light change on the leaves. That squeak was a violation. It was a sound that did not belong in my world. I picked up my heavy ceramic mug, the one my late wife, Helen, had given me for my 50th birthday, and walked around the side of the house. From the edge of my gravel driveway, I had a clear view down the long, paved access lane that ran the length of my property. It was my lane. It was part of the parcel I had purchased 5 years ago, a fact recorded in meticulous detail down at the county records office. And on my lane, not 20 yards from my house, a woman was directing two men as they set up not one, but three of those squeaking folding tables. A large, garishly colored bounce house, still a sad puddle of vinyl, lay on the grass beside it, its generator sitting ominously on a patch of my zoysia. The woman had her back to me. She wore a bright pink tracksuit and pointed with an authority that seemed to come as naturally to her as breathing. This was Carol Peterson, the president of the adjacent homeowners association, the estates at Whispering Creek. I had met her once briefly when I first moved in. She had a handshake like a vise and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I stood there for a full minute, mug in hand, just watching. A minivan pulled up behind the men, and a woman I didn't recognize began unloading stacks of plastic cups and paper plates. Carol gestured expansively, a queen directing the setup for a royal fete. She pointed toward the small, manicured clearing in the center of my vineyard, a spot I'd specifically designed for quiet contemplation, a place I often went to read. "The main food tables go there," she called out, her voice sharp and carrying in the still morning air. "We need the DJ to set up closer to the power outlet." I looked at the side of my workshop, where an exterior-grade GFI outlet was located. An orange extension cord was already snaked across the grass, its three-pronged mouth waiting. She had no idea. I walked slowly down the driveway, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't hurry. The situation was already happening. Haste would only add an element of chaos that I refused to entertain. As I approached, one of the men setting up the tables noticed me. He nudged his partner, and they both stopped, looking at me with a vague, uncertain apprehension. Carol, however, was oblivious until I was about 10 feet away. "Can I help you?" she asked, turning. The smile was there, brittle and immediate. It was the smile of someone who is not asking if they can help, but is instead demanding to know why you are interrupting them. "I think the question is, can I help you?" I said, keeping my voice even. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was a Colombian dark roast, and the bitter warmth was a small, solid anchor in the sea of absurdity I was witnessing. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry? This is private property," I stated. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, like stating the sky was blue. "This is my access lane. That is my grass. And that," I gestured with my mug toward the rows of grapevines, "is my vineyard." Carol's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The brittle smile dissolved, replaced by a look of patronizing condescension. She placed her hands on her hips, a classic pose of unimpeachable authority. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. "I'm Carol Peterson, president of the HOA. We're setting up for the annual Community Appreciation Day, a block party. It's been happening here for 15 years. "Not here, it hasn't," I said. "I've lived here for 5 years. It has never happened here." She laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Oh, that's adorable. Frank, the previous owner, was always so accommodating. We just continued the tradition. It's a community easement. Everyone knows that. This is the designated common area for large events." I looked at the men, who were now trying very hard to appear fascinated by the latches on their folding tables. I looked at the woman by the minivan, who was frozen with a stack of napkins in her hand. "There is no community easement," I said again, just stating a fact. "There is no designated common area. This parcel, from that fence line to the creek bed, and everything in between, including this pavement, belongs to me. You are trespassing." The condescension in her expression curdled into outright hostility. Her eyes narrowed. "Now you listen to me," she said, taking a step closer. She was a performer, and she was turning up the volume for her audience. "This path has been used by this community for decades. That's called historic use, prescriptive easement. You can't just buy a piece of land and cut off access that has been established for years. The HOA has a right to be here, and we are holding our event. We've sent out flyers to 150 homes. The caterers are coming at 9. The DJ is coming at 10. You are not going to ruin this for 200 people, including dozens of children, because you're having a bad morning. I took another sip of coffee. I let the silence hang in the air. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She saw a quiet, older man, a widower who lived alone and mostly kept to himself. She saw a pushover. She saw someone who would fold in the face of public pressure and thinly veiled legal threats. You have two options, she continued, her voice gaining a hard, menacing edge. You can go back inside your house and let us be, and we can all pretend this unpleasantness never happened. Or you can continue to be difficult. If you choose that path, I will have you fined by the HOA for interfering with a community event. Then I will call the sheriff for harassing me and my volunteers. And then, on Monday morning, I will have our lawyer file for an emergency injunction to formalize the easement and bill you for all our legal costs. Your little vineyard won't seem so peaceful when it has a $20,000 lien against it. Do you understand? I lowered my mug. I looked her directly in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Your event is not happening on my property, I said. Everything you are doing right now is being recorded. I tilted my head slightly toward the small, discreet camera mounted under the eaves of my porch, its tiny green light glowing steadily. Every word you just said has been recorded. You have 30 minutes to remove yourselves and all of this equipment from my land. If you are not gone by then, I will close and lock the gate at the entrance to this lane. Anyone and anything still on this property will remain here until the sheriff arrives to escort you off for criminal trespass. I turned and walked back to my house without another word. The crunch of my boots on the gravel was the only sound. I could feel her staring at my back, her fury a palpable force. She probably thought it was a bluff. She probably thought I was just some lonely old man trying to throw his weight around. She had no idea what she had just done. She hadn't just planned a party. She had declared war on a man who had spent 40 years as a professional land surveyor and expert witness in property law disputes. She had chosen to build her castle of arrogance on a foundation of pure documented fact, and I was the man who had drawn the map. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This storm hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It had been gathering for 5 years, and I had been tracking its path with the patient precision of a meteorologist. When Helen passed, the world lost its color. Our home, the one we had built and filled with 3 decades of life, suddenly felt cavernous and cold. Every corner held a memory that was both a comfort and a knife wound. After a year of rattling around in that empty space, I knew I needed a change. I needed a project. I was a surveyor by trade, a man who dealt in lines, boundaries, and the quiet, unassailable truth of deeds and plats. I craved order. I found it in a 20-acre parcel on the edge of town, nestled against a meandering creek. 10 acres were wild, wooded hillsides. The other 10 were gently sloped, perfect for what I had in mind, a small, private vineyard. It wasn't a commercial venture. It was a purpose, tending the vines, checking the soil, pruning the canes. It was a methodical, long-term process that my soul desperately needed. The property came with a modest but well-built house and a long private asphalt lane that led from the main county road back to the residence. On paper, it was a perfect sanctuary. The only catch was the estates at Whispering Creek. The development bordered my property to the north. It was a typical suburban enclave of 150 identical-looking houses with immaculate lawns and a powerful homeowners association. My property was not part of the HOA. This was a non-negotiable condition of the sale. I had spent my entire career untangling the messes created by poorly written covenants and overzealous board members. I wanted no part of it. The title search was clean. The survey I conducted myself confirmed the boundaries were ironclad. The access lane was mine, wholly and entirely. My first few years were peaceful. I was absorbed in my work, clearing the land, planting the first rootstock, installing the trellises. I was an object of mild curiosity to my neighbors in the estates. The quiet widower on the hill, with his strange farming project, I kept to myself. I waved when they walked or jogged past the entrance to my lane, but I didn't invite conversation. Peace was a fragile commodity, and I was hoarding it. It was during this time that I first became aware of Carol Peterson. I didn't know her name then. She was just the HOA lady. I'd hear stories and snippets from the mailman or at the local hardware store. She had apparently taken control of the board a few years before I arrived and ruled it with an iron fist. Her reign was one of pettiness and performance. She fined a family because their son's basketball hoop was 1 inch too close to the sidewalk. She demanded another family dig up their prize-winning rose bushes because they weren't on the pre-approved list of shrubbery. She seemed to derive a visceral pleasure from the enforcement of trivial rules. My first direct, albeit minor, interaction came about a year in. I received a formal-looking letter in a crisp envelope bearing the HOA's logo. It was a notice of violation. According to the letter, the grass on the verge between the county road and the start of my private lane was 1/4 of an inch too high. It cited a clause in the HOA bylaws and levied a $50 fine. I read the letter twice. I was not in the HOA. Their bylaws had as much authority over me as the rules of a Martian chess club. My first instinct, the surveyor's instinct, was to write a blistering, legally precise letter back, citing the relevant property records and telling them, in no uncertain terms, where they could file their notice. But then I thought of Helen. She had always been the diplomat. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Arthur, she'd say, usually after I'd gotten into a pedantic argument with a zoning official. More than that, I didn't want to fight. I wanted peace. A $50 fine was a small price to pay to be left alone. So I wrote a check for $50. I didn't write under protest in the memo line. I simply paid it. And then I did something that would become a habit. I made a copy of the notice, a copy of the check, and a copy of the envelope it came in. I put them all in a fresh manila folder. On the tab I wrote HOA. I kept the receipts. A few months later, another notice arrived. This time it was about a non-conforming fence, referring to the simple split-rail fence I had along the front of my property. It was there when I bought the place. The fine was $100. Again I considered fighting. Again I chose not to. The cost of my peace was, apparently, rising. I paid the fine. I made copies. I added them to the folder. This became the pattern. Every few months, a new trumped-up violation would appear. A weed in the gravel at the lane's entrance. A commercial vehicle, my pickup truck, parked in view of the road for more than an hour. Each time, I documented it, paid it, and filed it. The folder grew thicker. On paper, I was a compliant if somewhat negligent property owner. In reality, I was building a case file. I didn't know what I was building it for, exactly. But 40 years in my profession teaches you that documentation is never wasted. It's an investment in future certainty. The issue of the access lane first surfaced about 2 years into my residency. I came home one afternoon to find a small group of teenagers on skateboards using the smooth, gentle slope of my lane as their personal skate park. I politely asked them to leave, explaining it was private property. One of them, a cocky kid with a familiar glint of arrogance in his eyes, retorted, "Our mom said we can play here. It's a community path." I later learned he was Carol's son. That evening, I did some digging. I pulled the original plat maps for the estates at Whispering Creek and my own parcel. The lane was, as I knew, entirely mine. However, in the developer's initial filings, there was a footnote. It referenced a temporary access license granted to the developer during the construction phase, allowing their heavy equipment to use the lane to access the northernmost part of the development. The license had a clear expiration date, the day the final home in Phase 1 received its certificate of occupancy. That was 22 years ago. It also had a maintenance clause. The licensee was responsible for all upkeep. The lane was in good condition because the previous owner, Frank, had paid to have it resurfaced himself 10 years ago. I found a copy of the original license in the county archives. It was a simple, 2-page document, expired, void, worthless, but its existence, I suspected, was the seed of the myth Carol was perpetuating, the community path, the easement. She was relying on a folk memory of access, twisting it into a legal right that had never existed. This discovery changed the nature of my documentation. I installed 2 small, high-definition, cellular-connected cameras. One was on the eave of my house, overlooking the lane. The other was disguised as a birdhouse, positioned to have a clear view of the gate at the entrance. They recorded on motion, uploading the encrypted files to a secure cloud server. I began saving clips of every unauthorized use of the lane: joggers, kids on bikes, people walking their dogs, and more often than not, failing to pick up after them. Each clip was time-stamped, dated, and saved to a specific subfolder on my hard drive. cross-referenced with my HOA file. I was no longer just collecting receipts. I was collecting evidence. I had seen Carol's type before in depositions and courtrooms. The performative tyrant. They build a power base on charisma and intimidation. They create a reality bubble for themselves and their followers. A world where their feelings and assertions are more valid than deeds, contracts, or laws. They are fundamentally incurious about any fact that might contradict their narrative. Arguing with them is pointless. It's like wrestling a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and the pig enjoys it. The only way to deal with them is to let them build their own cage, then present them with the key. My folder, my server full of video files. These were the materials for her cage. And with her little block party, she was hammering the final nail into it herself. I went back inside my house and sat down at my desk. I didn't watch the clock. I simply opened my laptop and pulled up the live feed from the porch camera. Carol was gesturing angrily, her voice too low for the microphone to pick up clearly, but her body language was screaming. The two men looked cowed. They were loading the tables back onto their truck. The woman with the minivan was hastily shoving the cups and plates back into her vehicle. They were complying, but Carol was not. She was pacing back and forth on my asphalt, phone pressed to her ear. She was still there. That was a mistake. At precisely 7:12 a.m., 30 minutes after I had issued my warning, I stood up. I went to the small hook by my back door where a heavy, old-fashioned brass key hung. It was the key to the main gate. The gate was a sturdy, 10-foot-wide affair of welded steel that I had installed a year ago. I rarely closed it. It was more of a symbolic boundary than a practical one. Today, it would be very practical. I walked back outside. Carol's minivan was still there, parked halfway on the grass. The bounce house was still a puddle of vinyl. The generator was still sitting on my lawn. Carol herself was standing with her back to me, still on the phone. "I don't care what he said," I heard her say, her voice tight with fury. "It's a bluff. He's a lonely old crank. We are having this party." I didn't say a word. I just walked past her, past the minivan, all the way down the 300-foot length of the lane to the entrance. The gate was designed to be imposing, but it swung smoothly on its large, well-greased hinges. I pushed it closed. The two halves met with a soft metallic sigh. I slid the thick steel bolt across, securing it. Then I took the heavy padlock, threaded it through the bolt's housing, and snapped it shut. I inserted the brass key, gave it a firm turn, and then removed it. The click of the lock's tumblers settling into place was one of the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard. I turned and looked back up the lane. Carol had finally ended her call. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly agape. The full reality of the situation was beginning to dawn on her. Her minivan, the bounce house, the generator, and, most importantly, she herself, were now locked inside my property. I started walking back toward my house, dangling the brass key from my finger. Her expression shifted from shock to incandescent rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, starting to march toward me. "You can't do this. You are illegally detaining me. Open this gate right now." I kept walking at the same unhurried pace. "I am not detaining you, Carol," I said calmly, loud enough for the porch camera's microphone to pick it up clearly. "You are free to leave at any time. You can walk out the way you walked in. Your vehicle and your equipment, however, are on my property without my permission. They will remain here until the authorities arrive." "I will have you arrested," she screamed. Her face was flushed, her hands balled into fists. The performance was in full swing. "I welcome it," I said as I reached my driveway. "Please call the sheriff, I insist." I went inside, locked my front door, and sat back down at my desk. I pulled up the camera feed. Carol was pacing like a caged animal, screaming into her phone. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm now, but it didn't matter. I went back to my desk and got to work. Phase 1 was complete. Now, it was time to prepare for Phase 2. The first thing I did was not what you might expect. I did not call my lawyer. I did not call the sheriff myself. I simply opened a new document on my computer and began to type. I created a timeline, starting at 6:42 a.m., with the sound of the squeaking table. I noted every event, every conversation, every action, with precise timestamps pulled from my camera system. This is what expert witnesses do. They build a narrative of fact, unadorned by emotion or speculation. While I typed, I listened. Through the open window of my office, I could hear Carol's tirade. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. She was on the phone, presumably with the sheriff's department, and her voice was a cocktail of panic, outrage, and theatrical tears. She was claiming she was being held hostage by a mentally unstable and violent old man. She claimed I had threatened her. She claimed I had trapped her and her volunteers, who were just trying to do something nice for the community's children. I made a note of this. 7:28 a.m. Subject Carol Peterson makes a false report to law enforcement, alleging threats and false imprisonment. The porch camera was recording her every word. On paper, her claims would look serious. On video, with me sitting calmly inside my own home 100 yards away, they would look like what they were. A desperate fabrication. Next, I sent an email. It was to my old partner, David. The subject line was simple. A favor. The body of the email was concise. I attached a digital copy of my property deed, the full title report from when I purchased it, and a high-resolution scan of the original 1998 plat map for the estates at Whispering Creek. I also attached the scan of the expired temporary access license. David, I wrote, a small dispute has arisen with the neighboring HOA president, who claims a prescriptive easement over my access lane. Please review these documents. Specifically, I want you to look for any recorded easement, covenant, or right-of-way benefiting the HOA that I might have missed. I am 99% certain none exists, but I need 100%. Also, could you run a quick search on a Carol Peterson in this county and any adjacent ones for past civil litigation, particularly related to property or HOA matters? I have a feeling this isn't her first rodeo. Call me when you have a moment. Things are about to get interesting here. I hit send. David was more than my old partner. He was the sharpest researcher I knew. If there was a grain of truth to Carol's claims hidden anywhere in the mountain of public records, he would find it. If there wasn't, his confirmation would be another steel bar in the cage I was building. Then, I opened the HOA folder on my computer. It was meticulously organized. Subfolders for each year. Inside each, scans of the violation notices, the checks I'd sent, the envelopes. Another subfolder contained the video clips from my birdhouse camera, each file named with the date and a brief description. Jogger with dog, no cleanup, teenagers on skateboards, unknown vehicle parked for 3 hours. It was a 5-year history of minor but persistent trespass and harassment. I began to assemble a package. I selected the 3 most egregious fine notices, the one for the grass, the fence, and the pickup truck. I created a simple cover sheet listing the date, the alleged violation, and the amount paid for each. I added a printout of my deed's legal description, highlighting the section that defined my property lines. I printed a copy of the expired access license, and with a red pen, I circled the expiration date and the maintenance clause. This was my first contact package. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they would be walking into a situation framed by Carol's hysteria. I would not meet hysteria with more hysteria. I would meet it with a calm, organized, and easily digestible presentation of facts. I placed the documents into a crisp, new manila folder. On the tab, I wrote Sheriff's Dep. Incident Report. Preparation is about anticipating the needs of others, especially those in authority. A harried deputy doesn't want to listen to a long, rambling story. He wants clear, verifiable information. I was going to give it to him. A thought then occurred to me. Carol had based her entire argument on historic use and what Frank, the previous owner, had allowed. Frank was an elderly man who had moved to a retirement community in Arizona. I had his forwarding address somewhere in my closing documents. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. I spent 10 minutes digging through my old files before I found it. I composed another email, this one to Frank. Dear Frank, I wrote, hope this email finds you well and you're enjoying the Arizona sun. My name is Arthur Miller. I purchased your property on Creek Road 5 years ago. I'm writing to you today about a small issue that has come up. The local HOA president is claiming that there is a long-standing agreement for the community to use the private access lane for events. She mentioned you by name, stating you were always accommodating. I was wondering if you could clarify the nature of any arrangement you may have had. My records show only an expired construction license from the developer. But I want to be sure I have the full picture. Any light you could shed would be greatly appreciated. All the best, Arthur. It was a gentle, non-accusatory query. It gave him an easy out if he didn't want to be involved. But it also opened the door for him to confirm my own understanding of the situation. I sent the email and added a copy to my growing digital case file. The wail of a siren in the distance told me my quiet morning of preparation was over. It grew steadily louder, a sound I had always associated with other people's problems. Now it was coming for me. I stood up and walked to the window. A sheriff's cruiser was pulling up to the closed gate. A deputy stepped out, a tall man with a calm demeanor. He looked at the gate, then up the lane at Carol, who was already rushing toward him, her performance beginning anew. I picked up the manila folder I had prepared. I took a deep breath. I was not nervous. I was ready. My professional life had been a long series of moments like this. A dispute, two opposing narratives, and a resolution found in the unglamorous, indisputable truth of the documents. Carol was armed with outrage and assumptions. I was armed with a plat map, a deed, and a 5-year paper trail. She had no idea how outmatched she was. On paper, she was a concerned community leader being victimized. In reality, she was a trespasser who had just made a false police report, and I had the receipts for all of it. The deputy at the gate listened patiently to Carol. From my vantage point, I could see her gesticulating wildly, pointing first at my house, then at her trapped minivan, then at the sky as if calling down divine judgment. The deputy, whose name tag I would later learn read Sutton, just nodded, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He had a partner, a younger, sharper-looking deputy who was hanging back by the cruiser, observing. After several minutes of this one-sided conversation, Deputy Sutton keyed the radio on his shoulder. I couldn't hear what he said, but a moment later, the gate's pedestrian access, a smaller door built into the main frame, was unlocked remotely by dispatch. He walked through, leaving Carol outside the gate, and started the long walk up my lane. I met him on my front porch. I didn't invite him in. I stood on the top step, putting me at eye level with him. I held the folder in my left hand. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice even and professional. "I'm Deputy Sutton with the county sheriff's office. We received a call about a disturbance, a possible illegal detainment." "Good morning, Deputy," I replied, matching his calm tone. "I'm Arthur Miller, the owner of this property. There is no detainment. The woman who called you is free to leave at any time. Her vehicle is trespassing." Sutton's eyes were sharp. He was assessing me, comparing the reality of the calm man in front of him with the description he'd just been given. "She claims you've locked her in and threatened her." "I have locked my gate to prevent further trespassing," I said. "I have not threatened anyone. My security camera on the porch, right there," I pointed, "has been recording everything since before she arrived. I would be happy to provide you with the complete, unedited footage. It will confirm that the only threats made this morning were made by her to me." His eyes flicked up to the camera, then back to me. A flicker of something, interest, maybe respect, passed through his expression. This was the first pivot point. The moment a neutral authority begins to suspect that the initial report may not be the whole story. "She also claims this is a community access road," Sutton said, continuing his procedural script. "She is mistaken," I said. "This is where I hope I can save you some time." I held out the folder. "In here you will find a copy of my deed, which shows this lane is part of my private parcel. You will also find a copy of the official county plat map, which confirms the boundary lines. And you will find a copy of an expired temporary access license from 1998, which I believe is the source of her confusion. As you'll see, it expired over 2 decades ago." He took the folder. He didn't open it right away. He weighed it in his hand, his gaze fixed on me. "You seem very prepared, Mr. Miller." "I was a licensed land surveyor for 40 years, Deputy. My life's work is property lines and the documents that define them. I don't make assumptions about who owns what." That was the second pivot. I had established my credibility. I wasn't just an angry homeowner. I was an expert in the very subject of the dispute. I saw the younger deputy, who had walked up the lane behind Sutton, share a quick, subtle glance with his partner. Sutton opened the folder. He was silent for a full minute as he read the cover sheet, then looked at the deed, then the plat map. He unfolded the map, a large, professionally rendered document, and studied it intently. He traced the lines with his finger. He was thorough. I appreciated that. "This all seems to be in order," he said, his voice now carrying a different weight. It was less about procedural inquiry and more about dawning confirmation. "It is," I said. "The woman who called you, Carol Peterson, is the president of the neighboring HOA. For the past 5 years, she has been sending me violation notices and fines under the mistaken belief that my property falls under her authority." I gestured vaguely back toward my office. "I have a complete record of every notice and every check I sent to pay them, which I did simply to avoid conflict." The younger deputy's eyebrows shot up. You paid hay fines for a property that isn't in the HOA. Yes, I said. It was easier than arguing. Until today. Today, she decided to hold a party for 200 people in my vineyard. That crossed a line. Sutton closed the folder and handed it back to me. Okay, Mr. Miller, here's the situation. This is a civil matter. I can't force you to open your gate, and I can't force her to abandon her vehicle. But she is alleging a crime, false imprisonment. A crime she is welcome to leave at any time on foot, I countered gently. Her vehicle is a separate issue. It is parked on my land without my consent. It is by definition trespassing. I want her removed from my property. I also want to file a formal report for criminal trespass against her, and for filing a false police report, given what she told your dispatcher. I made sure to say this clearly and deliberately. I was not asking for a favor. I was making a formal request on the record. I would like your names and badge numbers for my report, please. Sutton's expression didn't change, but I felt the dynamic shift completely. I was no longer the subject of an investigation. I was now the primary victim, calmly and correctly asserting my rights. He looked at Carol, who was now standing by the pedestrian gate, watching us with a furious, impatient expression. He looked back at me. Mr. Miller, would you be willing to open the main gate to allow her to retrieve her vehicle and leave? If I were to broker that, he asked. It was a reasonable request, the path of least resistance. No, I said without hesitation. I gave her a 30-minute warning to leave. She refused. She chose to remain. This is the consequence of that choice. This is no longer a simple misunderstanding. She has made legal threats against me and has now involved law enforcement under false pretenses. The time for simple solutions is over. I want this documented. I want a record. Deputy Sutton was quiet for a moment. I could see the gears turning. He was a man of process, and he had just met another man of process, a man who had all his paperwork in order. All right, he said finally, with a small nod. Let's go have another talk with Miss Peterson. As they walked back down the lane, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. Arthur, it's David. David, good timing, I said, watching the deputies approach Carol. Good is one word for it, he said, his voice crackling with a familiar, caffeinated energy. I've looked at your documents. It's as clean as a whistle. That lane is yours. End of story. The expired license is just the cherry on top. But that's not the interesting part. I ran the name, Carol Peterson. And she's a professional, David said, not in a good way. She was the treasurer of an HOA in a community 2 counties over about 8 years ago. Left under a cloud of suspicion after a forensic audit found significant financial mismanagement. No charges were ever filed, but the whole board was forced to resign. Before that, she was involved in a series of civil suits over rental properties she managed. A lot of angry tenants claiming she'd forged documents and illegally withheld security deposits. She settled most of them out of court. This was the bombshell. This wasn't just a case of an overzealous HOA president. This was a pattern, a history of fraud and abuse of power. Carol wasn't just a tyrant. She was a predator who used minor positions of authority as a weapon and a shield. She had no idea how much trouble she was truly in. David, you are a magician, I said. Can you send me the links to the court records? Anything public. Already in your inbox, he replied. What are you going to do, Arthur? I watched as Deputy Sutton began speaking to Carol. Her posture was rigid, indignant. Even from a distance, I could see her shaking her head, denying everything. I'm going to let her finish digging her own hole, I said, and then I'm going to bury her in it, with paper. The conversation at the gate was not going well for Carol. I could tell by the way her frantic gestures became smaller and more contained, the way her confident, aggressive posture slowly deflated. Deputy Sutton was not yelling. He was speaking in the same calm, measured tone he had used with me, and it was clearly having a devastating effect on her. Performers like Carol thrive on escalation. When they are met with unshakable calm, their script falls apart. After about 10 minutes, the younger deputy walked back up the lane to me. His name tag read Kent. He had a small notepad in his hand. Mr. Miller, he said, his tone respectful. My partner has explained the civil nature of this to Miss Peterson. She is not accepting of it. She is demanding we arrest you. I see, I said. We are not going to do that, he continued with a slight shake of his head. However, to properly document this, I need to take your official statement. You mentioned filing a report for trespassing and for her false 911 call. Is that correct? That is correct, I confirmed. I want to press charges to the fullest extent possible, he began to write. Okay. Can you state for the record what happened this morning? I gave him the timeline, just as I had typed it out. I was factual and dispassionate. I described the arrival, the setup, the conversation where she threatened me with liens and legal action, my warning, and my subsequent locking of the gate. I made sure to quote her threats as accurately as I could remember them. Her exact words were that my vineyard wouldn't seem so peaceful with a $20,000 lien against it. Deputy Kent's pen scratched furiously across the page. And you have this on video? Audio and video, yes. High definition. He looked up from his pad. Mr. Miller, I'm going to be straight with you. The DA's office is reluctant to pursue misdemeanor trespass charges that stem from civil disputes. It can get messy, I understand, I said. But is filing a false police report, alleging threats and false imprisonment, also considered messy? A thin smile touched the corner of his mouth. No, sir. They take that very seriously, especially when the evidence contradicting the claim is on video. He clicked his pen. Okay. What about the vehicle? The minivan and the other equipment can stay right where they are, I said. I will be having them legally towed and impounded at the owner's expense. I will contact a towing company as soon as you have finished your report. And Miss Peterson? She can walk off my property and wait for her ride on the county road, I said. She is no longer welcome here. Deputy Kent nodded, finished his notes, and thanked me. As he turned to leave, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods bordering my property and the estates. A man was standing there, half hidden behind an old oak tree. He was elderly, wearing a cardigan despite the warming day. He looked familiar. It was Mr. Henderson, one of the neighbors I'd seen Carol berating in the past over the state of his lawn. He was watching the whole drama unfold, a fearful but fascinated expression on his face. When he saw me looking, he gave a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod, then shrank back behind the tree. He was the first crack in Carol's wall of community support. He was afraid, but he was watching. A short while later, the deputies escorted a fuming Carol Peterson off my property through the pedestrian gate. She shot me a look of pure venom as she passed. It was a promise of future retribution. I simply watched, my expression neutral. Her minivan remained on my lawn, a monument to her arrogance. The deflated bounce house looked like a beached whale. As soon as the deputy's cruiser pulled away, I made 2 calls. The first was to a heavy-duty towing company I had used before. I explained the situation, gave them the make and model of the minivan, and told them it was an illegal trespass tow. They promised to be there within the hour. The second call was to my lawyer, not because I was scared, but because Carol's partner told me this was about to escalate beyond a simple property dispute. This was going to turn into a legal war, and I intended to deploy overwhelming force. Arthur, my lawyer, Ben said, his voice already weary. Don't tell me you've finally gotten into a fight with your HOA. Worse, I said, my non-HOA. And I didn't start it, Ben. I just finished it. I'm sending you a file. It's got everything. Deeds, maps, videos, a 5-year history of harassment, and the rap sheet on the HOA president. She's threatened a frivolous lawsuit. I want you to be ready to file a countersuit so fast it gives her whiplash. I want damages for harassment, for trespass, and I want a permanent restraining order filed against her, keeping her off my property. Arthur, he started, about to give his standard let's de-escalate speech. And I want you to bill it all to her, Ben, I interrupted. Every minute of your time, every filing fee. I have her on camera making a direct financial threat to me. We're going to hold her to it. There was a pause on the line. Ben had known me for 20 years. He knew my temperament. He knew I didn't do things by halves. Okay, Arthur, he said, his tone shifting from weary to engaged. Send me the file. Let's get to work. That afternoon, as the tow truck was hooking up Carol's minivan, another email arrived. It was from Frank, the previous owner. His reply was short and to the point. Arthur, good to hear from you. Hope the Vineyard is coming along. Regarding the lane, you are correct. The developer used it during construction, that's it. I never gave the HOA permission to use it for events. In fact, the president back then, a nice lady named Margaret, asked me once, and I politely refused. The woman you're dealing with now sounds like a real piece of work. I had a few run-ins with her myself before I moved. If you need me to sign an affidavit to that effect, just let me know. Happy to help. Best, Frank. I saved the email as a PDF. I forwarded it to Ben with the subject line, Witness. The final piece of the puzzle for that day fell into place just before dusk. A plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. There was no stamp, no address. It had been hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an email. The sender was the HOA's lawyer. The recipient was Carol Peterson. The date was from 6 months ago. The email was a legal opinion. The lawyer was responding to a query from Carol about the access lane on my property. The advice was unequivocal. Carol, it read, I have reviewed the plat maps as you requested. The Miller property is not part of the HOA, and the access lane is wholly owned by him. There is no recorded easement. Any historic use is irrelevant without a claim of adverse possession, which would be nearly impossible to prove and astronomically expensive to litigate. Under no circumstances should the HOA attempt to use this lane for any official function. Doing so would expose the association to significant legal and financial liability. Please consider this matter closed. At the bottom of the page, someone had written in shaky, anonymous handwriting. She read this out loud at the board meeting. Then she told us the lawyer was an idiot and we were going to do it anyway. I'm sorry, I can't give my name. This was the disillusioned insider. This was the bombshell. It wasn't just that Carol was wrong. It was that she knew she was wrong. She had been explicitly warned by her own legal counsel in writing and had chosen to ignore it, lying to her own board in the process. This elevated her actions from simple arrogance to willful misconduct. This was the document that would not just win me my case, but would utterly destroy her credibility and authority. I placed the anonymous letter into a new clear plastic sleeve. I handled it by the edges, preserving any potential fingerprints. This wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a weapon. The quiet, methodical work was done. The folder was complete. Now I just had to wait for her to make her next inevitable move. She had no idea she was already checkmated. She was just playing out the last few futile moves of a game she had lost before it even began. The next move came faster than I expected. On Monday morning, a process server showed up at my door. He handed me a thick packet of documents. It was a request for a temporary restraining order and a civil lawsuit filed by Carol Peterson on behalf of the HOA. I thanked the man, closed the door, and sat down to read. It was a work of fiction that would have made a novelist blush. In her sworn declaration, Carol painted me as an unhinged recluse who had launched an unprovoked campaign of terror against the peaceful, family-oriented community. She claimed the access lane was a vital thoroughfare for residents, and that my locking the gate was an act of malicious imprisonment that had traumatized her and the children who witnessed it. There were no children present, of course, but details like that were irrelevant in her narrative. The lawsuit demanded the court recognize a prescriptive easement, order me to permanently unlock the gate, and pay the HOA $100,000 in punitive damages for the emotional distress I had caused. The community. Attached were sworn affidavits from 2 of her board member allies, the ones I called the sycophants, backing up her story. They were perjuring themselves in writing. I scanned every page and emailed the PDF to Ben. His reply was almost instantaneous. This is a gift, Arthur. She's lying under oath in a public document. This is beautiful. He was right. She had taken her performance and committed it to a court filing. She had built her entire legal strategy on a foundation of provable lies. Ben filed our response that same afternoon. It was a motion to dismiss her lawsuit as frivolous, a countersuit for damages, and a request for a temporary restraining order against her. We didn't ask for $100,000. We asked for specific, documented costs. The price of the tow and impound for her van, the cost of repairing the patch of lawn where the generator had sat, and Ben's legal fees, which were already climbing into the thousands. We also requested that the court declare Carol a vexatious litigant, based on the history David had uncovered. The centerpiece of our filing was the evidence. We attached everything: the deed, the plat map, the expired license, the sheriff's incident report number, the sworn affidavit from Frank which he had happily provided, and as Exhibit A, we included the anonymous letter from the insider, showing Carol had willfully ignored the advice of her own lawyer. We didn't speculate on who sent it. We simply presented it as evidence of her bad faith. The court scheduled a hearing for the following week. In the meantime, the battle shifted to the community itself. Carol, realizing she couldn't win on facts, went on the offensive with propaganda. A special edition of the HOA newsletter was distributed. It was a masterpiece of misinformation. It had the headline, "Local man terrorizes neighborhood, holds president hostage." It repeated all the lies from her lawsuit and painted me as a threat to the safety and property values of everyone in the estates. It ended with a plea for residents to attend the upcoming HOA emergency meeting to show solidarity and vote on a special assessment to fund the legal defense of our community. She was trying to use social pressure to intimidate me and to rally her base. It was a classic move from her playbook, but this time it backfired. The first sign was a phone call I received on Tuesday evening. It was Mr. Henderson, the man I'd seen hiding behind the tree. His voice was frail, but determined. He said, "My name is George Henderson. I live at number 42. I saw it happen on Saturday. I saw it all. That woman has been bullying this neighborhood for years. I've been fined 3 times because my arthritis makes it hard to mow my lawn as often as she'd like. What she is saying about you in this newsletter, it's just wicked." "Thank you for calling, Mr. Henderson," I said. "I have something," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "From the old days, from Margaret, the president before Carol." He explained that after Frank had denied the original request to use the lane, Margaret had sent out a community-wide letter explicitly stating that the lane was private property and off-limits to residents. It was a formal acknowledgement of my property rights from the HOA itself. He had kept a copy. "I keep everything," he said, a man after my own heart. Would it help, Mr. Henderson?" I said slowly, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "It would help a great deal. You may have just become the most important man in this neighborhood." He brought the letter over an hour later, delivering it with the furtive air of a spy passing state secrets. It was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved. Another piece of irrefutable, documented history. Another nail. The second sign of her plan backfiring was the emergence of the disillusioned insider. The day after the newsletter came out, I received an email from an anonymous Proton Mail account. "My name is Sarah Collins," it began. "I am on the HOA board. I am the one who sent you the lawyer's letter. I cannot stay silent any longer. Carol has been lying to the board for months. She controls the agenda. She shouts down anyone who disagrees with her, and 2 of the other board members, Mark and Linda, just vote for whatever she says. The 5th member, Tom, is too scared to speak up. She is trying to pass a $10,000 special assessment to pay for this lawsuit. It's madness. I am willing to testify to what I know. I will be at the emergency meeting. Please be there." The coalition was forming. The fearful ally and the disillusioned insider, the silent, cowed majority was beginning to find its voice, galvanized by Carol's overreach and my quiet, unyielding resistance. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, 2 days before our court hearing. It was to be held in the community clubhouse. Carol's intention was clear. She wanted to hold a public trial, to have me condemned by a vote of the people before we ever saw a judge. She wanted to secure her war chest and march into court with the full backing of the HOA. She had no idea that I, along with Ben, had been preparing for this very event. The meeting wasn't going to be her coronation. It was going to be her deposition. We prepared a presentation. Not a flashy one, just a simple methodical series of slides. Each slide contained a single scanned document, the deed, the plat map, the expired license, Frank's affidavit, Mr. Henderson's letter from the previous HOA president, the sheriff's incident report cover page, the anonymous letter from Sarah, which we simply titled Exhibit G, and finally, screenshots of the public court records from Carol's past legal troubles. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension and cheap coffee. Carol's supporters, Mark and Linda and a handful of others, were clustered at the front, a phalanx of self-righteousness. The rest of the room was a mix of curious, anxious, and angry faces. I saw Mr. Henderson sitting in the back, clutching a folder of his own. I saw Sarah Collins near the middle, her face pale but resolute. I took a seat in the back row with Ben beside me, his briefcase on his lap. Carol stood at the podium basking in the attention. She was in her element. This was her stage. She began her performance with a trembling voice, recounting her fabricated tale of terror. She spoke of her fear, of her dedication to the community, of the dark cloud that had descended upon their peaceful neighborhood in the form of a hostile, litigious outsider. She was good. I had to give her that. She was weaving a compelling narrative of victimhood. And that is why, she concluded, her voice rising to a crescendo, we must stand together. We must fund this fight to protect our rights, our children's safety, and our property values. I am asking for a vote to approve a special legal fund assessment of $10,000. A smattering of applause came from her section. She smiled, a triumphant, confident smile. Then, from the middle of the room, Sarah Collins stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Carol's smile froze. "Sarah, this isn't the time for questions." "This isn't a question," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "It's a point of order. According to our bylaws, before a vote on a special assessment, the board must present all relevant financial and legal information to the homeowners. You have not done that. You have not told them that our own lawyer explicitly advised you against this course of action 6 months ago." A murmur went through the crowd. Carol's face went white. "That is a privileged communication. You are out of order." "No," Ben said, standing up. He wasn't loud, but his voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "She is not. My name is Benjamin Carter. I am Mr. Miller's legal counsel. We are in active litigation, which makes this a public meeting of material interest. And since you have chosen to defame my client and misrepresent the facts of this case to these homeowners to solicit funds, you have waived that privilege." He walked to the front of the room and placed a small USB stick into the projector that was set up for Carol's presentation. "Mr. Miller is not a monster," Ben said to the crowd. "He is a quiet man who was pushed too far. You have heard Carol's story now. I would like to present you with the facts, on paper." And then he began. Slide by slide, document by document, he dismantled her entire narrative. He showed the deed. He showed the map. He showed the letter from Mr. Henderson, who stood up and held up his original copy when his name was called. He showed the affidavit from Frank. He showed the letter from their own lawyer. With each slide, the murmuring in the room grew louder. Carol's face had gone from white to a mottled, unhealthy shade of red. Her supporters, Mark and Linda, looked stunned, as if seeing the documents for the first time. The final slide was the screenshot of the court case from the other county, detailing the financial mismanagement. A collective gasp went through the room. "Carol Peterson did not tell you the truth," Ben said, his voice quiet but damning. "She did not tell you this lane was private. She did not tell you her lawyer told her to stand down. She did not tell you that she was the one who made threats, not Mr. Miller. She lied to you to cover up her own misconduct, and now she is asking you to pay for her lies." He turned to face Carol. "This entire lawsuit is based on perjury, and we have the recordings to prove it." That was the moment. The collapse. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. For a fraction of a second, her face was completely blank. The shock was so profound it wiped all expression away. Then came the panic. A wild, cornered animal look flashed in her eyes. She gripped the podium, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had spent years building a reality bubble, and it had just been popped by a quiet man with a folder and a lawyer. She had no idea. She had no script for this. The room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers. Someone called for her immediate resignation. Mark and Linda were trying to shrink into their chairs. Mr. Henderson was being clapped on the back by his neighbors. Sarah Collins was crying, tears of relief. I didn't say a word. I just sat in the back, watching the chaos Carol had sown finally come home to roost. Ben packed up his laptop, and we walked out, leaving the HOA to tear itself apart. The war was over. All that was left was the cleanup. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA meeting descended into chaos after we left. A motion was made from the floor by one of the homeowners to recall Carol Peterson as president. It passed with a near-unanimous vote. Her two allies on the board, Mark and Linda, abstained, their faces pale with shock and dawning self-preservation. Sarah Collins was nominated to serve as interim president, a role she accepted with a mixture of terror and resolve. The first official act of the new board, passed that very night, was to withdraw the lawsuit against me. The second was to formally censure Carol for her willful misconduct and for exposing the association to legal jeopardy. The special assessment she had demanded was, of course, soundly rejected. Instead, they voted to hire an independent auditor to go over the HOA's finances for the entire duration of Carol's presidency, a direct result of the information Ben had presented. Our court hearing, scheduled for that Saturday, became a mere formality. Carol's lawyer, no doubt horrified at having been lied to by his own client and seeing the mountain of evidence against her, had already filed the motion to withdraw. We still attended. Ben stood before the judge and laid out the basic facts, not to argue the case, but to put the final official seal on it. "Your Honor," he stated. While the plaintiff has withdrawn their frivolous suit, my client has incurred significant costs due to the defendant's malicious actions. We have a video of Miss Peterson making a direct threat to place a $20,000 lien on my client's property. We are simply asking the court to hold her to her own valuation. The judge, a stern woman who had clearly read all the filings, looked over her glasses at Carol, who was sitting alone at the plaintiff's table. Her lawyer had made a point of sitting in the gallery behind her, a clear signal of professional distance. Miss Peterson, the judge said, her voice cold as ice, you filed a sworn declaration filled with what appears to be blatant falsehoods. You ignored the advice of your own counsel. You attempted to use this court to harass a private citizen. You have wasted the court's time and the defendant's money. This is not acceptable. She did not grant us the full $20,000, but she did something almost as satisfying. She dismissed Carol's suit with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again. She granted our restraining order, legally barring Carol from setting foot on my property or contacting me in any way. And she ordered Carol, personally, not the HOA, to pay for all of my legal fees, the cost of the tow, and an additional $5,000 in punitive damages for filing a vexatious lawsuit. On paper, it was a complete and total victory. The financial consequences for Carol were just beginning. The audit of the HOA books, conducted over the next few months, uncovered what David's research had hinted at. A pattern of mismanaged funds, questionable contracts awarded to friends, and a slush fund of fine money that was largely unaccounted for. The district attorney's office, armed with the audit and the evidence from my case, particularly her filing of a false police report, decided to press charges. She was eventually convicted of misdemeanor fraud and perjury, sentenced to probation, and a hefty community service requirement. The public humiliation was absolute. The community began to heal. Under Sarah Collins's leadership, the HOA started a process of reform. The thick book of petty, vindictive rules was reviewed. Many were rescinded. All the fines Carol had levied over the past 2 years, including the ones I had paid, were declared null and void. A few weeks after the court hearing, I received a check in the mail from the HOA. It was a full refund for every fine I had ever paid, with a handwritten note from Sarah at the bottom. A new beginning, it said. My relationship with the neighborhood changed. I was no longer the strange, reclusive widower on the hill. I was Arthur, the man who had stood up to the bully Mr. Henderson would stop by with vegetables from his garden. Other neighbors, people I'd only ever seen from a distance, would now wave, smile, and sometimes stop at the end of my lane to chat. They'd ask about the vineyard, and I'd tell them about the different grape varietals, the challenge of the soil, the slow, patient work of cultivation. I even hosted a small, informal wine tasting on my back porch for Sarah and the new board members. A gesture of goodwill, we used the good glasses. I had my peace back, but it was a different kind of peace. It was not the fragile, hoarded peace of solitude, but a more robust peace, one built on secure boundaries and mutual respect. The heavy steel gate at the end of my lane remained, a silent testament to the battle that had been fought and won. I rarely locked it anymore, but the key still hung by my back door, a tangible symbol of the order that had been restored. It was a reminder that sometimes the only way to achieve peace is to be willing to fight for it, but not with anger or emotion, but with the quiet, unyielding power of the truth. Sometimes, in the early mornings, as I sit on my porch with my coffee, I look at that gate. I think about the nature of ownership. It isn't just a piece of paper in a county office. It's not just a line on a map. It's a responsibility to be a steward of the land, but also a responsibility to maintain the boundaries that allow for a civil society. Rules and laws, like fences and gates, are not just there to keep people out. They are there to create a space where everyone knows where they stand. They create order from chaos. Carol believed that rules were something to be wielded, a tool for power and control. She thought ownership was about dominance. She was wrong. True ownership is about care, cultivation, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing your lines are clear and your foundations are solid. My vineyard was thriving. The vines, now in their 5th year, were strong and healthy, their roots deep in the soil I had so fiercely defended. The grapes were small, but promised a good harvest. It was a project that would outlast me, a legacy of patience and meticulous care. I had kept the receipts, I had held the line, and in the end I had earned my quiet, and it tasted sweeter than any wine I could ever hope to make.